Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Corda. I'm the Director of Business Development for Tech Collective, and on behalf of the Tech Collective, we're pleased to have you here with us today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our organization, we're the IT Industry Association for the state of Rhode Island. So we provide trainings as well as times to meet with other people who are in the IT professional world, share best practices, share ideas, different groups that come together with us. And then through COVID, we've begun producing these wonderful virtual content areas where many of our members and partners have shared of their time with us. Two things just to mention that we're doing right now, some small business programming called the Road to Resilience to really help our small businesses stay cyber secure, especially during this difficult time, as well as a laptop loaner program. So if there are companies that are on the call that have laptops that they're either willing to loan or to give to small businesses that might not have been ready for this, if you would please contact me at the end, that would be wonderful. I appreciate it. But on for the reason that you're all here today, not to hear about what we do. We are thrilled to have our long-term member as well as supporter Vertical 6 presenting with Wolf & Company on system and organization controls, both 1 and 2. Doug Gerth is from Wolf & Company. They are a local CPA firm since 1911, and I've found out when we spoke with them that in order to do SOC analysis, you need to be a CPA. So he is the right person for this. He has been in the security space for 25 years in various capacities. And then Meredith Carroll is representing Vertical 6. She's been in the IT industry for over 20 years. And she assists clients develop business-specific and cost-effective policies, technical strategies in response to audit findings. And when I had asked Meredith if there was anything else she wanted me to share, she said that she at this point is grateful for her 2 teenage children, that they are teenagers and able to do their homeschooling on their own and kind of manage it, and at least doesn't have toddlers climbing bookcases while she's on calls like this.
So I can be here without them.
Yes. So we are grateful for them too, since we get to share in your body of knowledge because they're old enough to be okay on their own. But I'd like to thank you both for your time, for your organizations, sharing your expertise with us. And I hand the floor over to you both.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Monica, and the Tech Collective. We appreciate it, and Vertical 6 having us. My name, as she said, is Doug Gerth. I'm with Wolf & Company, and this is SOC 101, so we'll get started. So you'll hear a lot of terms on SOC, and you have to know who and what it is and who's asking for it. So a service organization was a vendor that you would outsource or a product or a service to, like a cloud vendor. You would ask a person like that. The service auditor is someone like Wolf, and that is the auditor is a CPA firm. They have to be a CPA firm to do that SOC report. The user entity would be a company as yourself, and then a user auditor would be someone that is auditing you and asking for the SOC reports to look at to make sure that you're doing due diligence. It's the checks and balances. A SOC report is not a silver bullet for anything, but if you're getting vendor management questionnaires or giving them, it'll take care of a lot of things because it shows that you're doing your due diligence in relation to the vendors that you're using and deem critical in your process.
So asking an organization for their SOC report is part of your your vendor management program.
Correct. So there are 2 different types of SOC reports. And I wrote up here AICPA to emphasize that it is the American Institute of CPAs, Certified Public Accountants, that issue these reports. A SOC 1, in all simple terms, is something that has financial impact. like a payroll provider or someone that's going to affect your balance sheet. You also hear that referred to as an SSAE 18. The SOC 2 report, which is much more common, reports on the controls that a service organization has to protect that data or whatever that you're attesting to. And we'll get into the different principles and criteria on that as well.
So on the SOC 1, we're talking about they're companies that are handling financial data, and we want to make sure that the integrity of that handling is appropriate.
Correct. And that, again, now there's type 1 versus type 2 to make it even more confusing for people. So now we have a SOC 1 and a SOC 2, but you can have a SOC 1 type 1 or a SOC 1 type 2. And a type 1, I always tell people it's like drawing a line in the sand. It's as a specified date. So if we're looking at a company and you're saying July 31st, that's your specified date. And we would ask for samples when we're starting to ask for things for operating effectively, controls that are operating effectively. We're asking for a sample of 1 for that specified date. A type 2 is over a period of time throughout that specified period of time. So if you had your first one that ended on the 31st of July, the next one would start August 1st of 2020 and go to July 31st of 2021. So, and then we'll get into the minutia and a little bit more into the weeds. But again, this is going to be a high level of an overview of the SOC 1, SOC 2s. Meredith, what else would you add to that specified date?
Yeah, so a lot of companies, when they first go down the process or down the path of getting a SOC report done, they'll start with the type 1, right? Because the type 1 will say, I have these policies, I have these procedures that I say I'm following. And so the SOC 2 type 1 is going to say, yes, you have all those policies in place. The SOC 2 type 2 or SOC 1 type 2 would say that you then followed those policies and procedures over the specified period of time, right?
Correct.
The type 2 is a lot more intensive in terms of how much evidence you need to supply to support the audit process. This is a lot more effort that goes into it for both the auditor and the organization being audited.
Correct. So, and as Meredith alluded to, that type 1 is a good starting point, and we always recommend that. Very rarely, as a CPA firm, do we see someone jump right to a type 2. A lot of times, contractually, people will start this with a software as a service or some kind of platform that they're running. They'll try, from a contract standpoint, for a large vendor, say, I want to go right to a type 2. And usually we can talk them off that ledge and have them go down the right path, because that client that's looking for that contractual obligation to fill a SOC 2 type 1 or type 2 right away, they'll say, well, we'll accept that. We know that you're taking the steps, and a type 1's a little bit easier to get and an easier lift from the standpoint. And this doesn't matter. We have companies that are 5-6 people, and we have people that are multi-thousand people in the company. It doesn't matter the size. So the type 1 for that 6-person company is the same process that you're going to have to use for multi-thousand people in a company.
And I think too, we find that when a company first undertakes a SOC audit, you'll find that there are a lot of processes that are followed but not necessarily documented. So there's a lot of work that goes into then documenting those policies and procedures, disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans, acceptable use policies, all those things need to be written down so that they can be provided as evidence for that SOC report. In the type 2. So if we take Doug, for example, the acceptable use policy, if your process is that every user has to sign that when they come on board, or has to have signed that as of when it was adopted, your type 2 is going to then look for, show me for these 6 people, where did they sign that report?
Correct.
So
and
different levels of effort.
And as Meredith can attest to, and Vertical 6 helps, and we do, there's a thing called a SOC readiness, and that's paramount when you're starting down this path for SOCs, that you do a readiness, because it's someone that's holding your hand and going through that process and making sure you may be doing things, but is it documented? Is that procedure, and are you following it? So they kind of walk through that. And with this type 1, and if we did it on July 31st and you're doing, we can go right up to that time frame to show that you're have that control in place. You don't have to show that it's been operating for 12 months, but you do have it, and we believe you.
Doug, do we want to talk a little bit about how frequently SOC reports should be done?
Well, that's a good question, Meredith. I would say on an annual basis, that's your target. So if you started, as I said, that type 1 in July, and then the following would be 12 months, sometimes people slip, or sometimes people, larger companies, if they do major changes and they have a type 2, they might make a 3-month type 2 window, which is very short, but they're proving that that control is operating effectively and that it's documented. Everything is, all the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed. Primarily, we see that 12 months. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it extends a little bit longer. And Meredith, if you want to explain what happens if you extend that and what kind of reporting that you have to, what has to go along with that report.
So frequently we'll see, we'll request a SOC report from a data center, for instance, and maybe it's been 13 or 14 months since their last SOC report. What we will request from them at that point is what's called a bridge letter. So the data center then would attest to the fact that there have not been substantial changes to their process or operation since the time that the SOC report was issued, giving their customer assurances that the SOC report is largely still valid. Certainly we want to see those reports being generated on a regular basis, but the bridge letter can help to alleviate concerns between those two SOC reports.
You're exactly right. And another thing is, if contractually you're obligated to have a SOC report and you're not quite there yet, we as a CPA firm or whoever you contract with can offer you a letter that you are under contract and you're taking the steps necessary. And probably 98% of the time they'll accept that. So a little bit more history on the SOC 1, which is now, or SSAE 18 report. It used to be a SAS 70, which was replaced by the SSAE 16 in 11, and now the 16 was replaced by the SSAE 18 in 2017. It comes both in that type 1 and type 2 format. And I always tell people, as I mentioned earlier, why a SOC 1? Is there a financial impact? And so if you were using ADP or Paychex or whoever you use for your payroll provider, that's someone that you want to ask for a SOC 1 report because it has a financial impact to your business as well. On the SOC 2 report, again, that comes in the type 1 and type 2 flavors. But that has trusted services principles or criteria, and there's 5 of them, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And the type 1, I'll back up a little bit. The type 1 can have controls in place, control objectives, and you could have, we just did one that was 4 control objectives, and they had about 7 to 10 controls underneath each objective. And we also just did one for somebody that had 19 control objectives. So you kind of define the control objectives with our assistants or whoever, and then you build from that. On the SOC 2 report, it's a little bit more straightforward where these principles and criteria are already set. And all of them, there's 5, have to have the security criteria principle as a cornerstone.
So I think on the next slide, we jump into what those service principles are. But as I look at, if I look at Vertical 6, certainly we want to be evaluating ourselves with the security principles. But, when we look at availability, if we have a promised uptime or a promised SLA, are we able to meet those SLAs would be part of what we would evaluate ourselves on.
Correct. And Meredith, probably over 90 full 94%, 95% of our SOC 2s are in that security and availability. The other fill up the confidentiality piece. And then processing integrity we've done before, and privacy we've done, but privacy is really looking at more things, and that is a dramatic increase in price from what we've seen. So security and availability are your two most popular trust principles. So
if you're using Office 365 and they promise a 99.99% availability, that promise is what their SOC report will be evaluating them against. How are they making themselves available at that SLA?
Correct. And there's other things to make things more confusing that we really don't get into, but there's subservice and carve-outs that you might be using Amazon or Azure or some other cloud service, and you're asking for their SOC, which is great as you're part of your vendor due diligence. But you can't use their SOC to put on your website. That's a big no-no as a part of your due diligence. You're getting that from a carved out, from a subservice provider, from a secondary source. You can't be telling someone that your SOC 2, you've done an attestation to SOC 2, which I've seen before, and told the people, oh, I've seen you've gone through this process before, and they said, no, we haven't. We just use Amazon's. I was like, well, that's really not how the rules follow, and the AICPA would be very upset with you for having that logo up on your website. Right. So you also have to be very careful of that and cognizant of it.
Right. So just because I store my clients' backups potentially in Azure, it's still my security and my process that's important in protecting those backups as they sit in the cloud. So even though Azure's cloud has a SOC 2, my process sitting on top of that also needs one.
You're correct. And we're seeing more and more that clients through their due diligence are saying it's nice that you're using these secondary cloud providers or a data center, but we want to know what you're doing as well in that process in the whole grand scheme of things. So that's why we're seeing a tremendous uptick in SOC 2 requests.
And let me just quick note, if anyone has a question and you want to put it in the chat, I'll be happy to bring that question up for the two of us. So if there's any comments or questions that you want to make, just click the chat button and the chat window will appear on the right side of your screen.
So these are some types of, as we discussed earlier, different types of SOC reports and products and services that people offer. The payroll providers, which I had mentioned, data processors, loan servicing, so hopefully that your financial institution that you're dealing with, bank, credit union, whoever, they're heavily regulated. And when we as an auditor come in and we probably have between 350 and 400 financial institutions that we deal with, this is a type of stuff that we're looking for as a part of our audit process, that they're doing their due diligence and asking the vendor management questions. And we have to look at multiple SOC reports within a financial institution. On a SOC 2, it might be a managed service provider, that cloud computing that we talked about, a data center, someone who's, a software as a service. There's all different scenarios depending on, and I always tell people, when you get a questionnaire from someone and they ask for a SOC report, make sure you ask what type of criteria it's based off of, if it's a SOC 2. If they just say a SOC report, and I think some people, you'll see SOC and they'll think it's a security operations center, which right. This is not. Meredith can go into more detail about that, but make sure you ask questions back to whoever is asking you the questions of why you need a SOC. And then I always tell people to be very wary, because if they have old language like that SAS 70 or SSAE 16, that they're using dated questionnaires, that they should update their own process, because and that shows that you're paying attention too. And I've had people call me about SOC 2s and talk about, oh, we're supposed to get this under contract. And I said, well, what kind of principles do you want? Do you want just security, or security and availability, confidentiality? And you start listing them, and then they'll go back, and one person said, I need all 5. and then they went back to the person and they said, no, they came back and they said, I only need that security and availability. So there's questions that you can ask, and Meredith can be a resource, and myself, Jonna, there's a lot of different people that you can ask to kind of guide you through these murky waters.
Well, and really, determining which trust principles you need to be looking at is a conversation between you and your audit team, right? So they need to really understand what your business is to determine what trust principles that need to be included. So, Vertical 6 went through a long conversation process about what we are holding for clients and what we're doing for clients, and how that then applies to the various principles within the SOC report. So it really is. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not always an easy question to answer. So it's a conversation. It's a consultation. It's really diving into the business to find out what's important.
And I always try to ask people, Meredith, if you could rate yourself from a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, of where you think you are on your documentation, policies, procedures. And people are pretty honest of where they have to be, and that kind of gives you kind of a roadmap of what you're going to be up against on the SOC readiness, and having to get things and documented and everything in place before you take that SOC 2 type 1 step, or going to the next thing.
Yeah, and it is, I think I alluded to it before. This process is an investment in time and money, right? So, getting the policies ready to give to your auditor, potentially developing policies or writing down, like I had mentioned before, sort of native processes, getting those documented. It's an investment. So, and I think, Doug, the lower you rate yourself on that scale to 1 to 10, the higher your time investment is going to be as you work through this process.
You're exactly right. I've had people that we've started in last year. I started with someone in February, did the readiness review. They had so much work to do. We weren't back until October to do their SOC 2 type 1. So they were rated themselves very low, and they knew that they had a lot of work to do, which they did. So the other thing is, you'd asked about time frames before too. You want to let a period of time, that 12 months is a nice time frame for us as an auditor to come in, and that you can collect artifacts based on your control, the controls that you have placed. We're looking for operating effectiveness. Whenever I tell somebody, HR is a good one. Your hiring policy, onboarding, do you do background checks, offboarding? So we ask, when you've hired someone, and smaller companies are harder to do this for, but you may have hired a couple people. Well, we're going to come in and say, you have this policy, this is how you're supposed to do things, show us. We're from Kansas, I don't believe you. Or from Missouri, I'm sorry. I don't believe you. And then you have to come up with those. You don't want us to have a finding and a response or an opinion in your report saying that you're missing something. Well, we asked you for 6 of these, you could only give us 5. And as an auditor too, we have very strict independence rules that we can't be a part of your controls. So maybe the first year we could help you with something from a very small standpoint, but from an independence standpoint, we would like to remove ourselves from that. We're not writing policies and procedures for you. You bring in someone else and take care of all of that for you, because we can't check ourselves.
One thing that's interesting too, Doug, you mentioned the HR piece of it. People, when they think of doing a SOC audit, they're thinking technology, but it's people, process, technology, right? It's
You're
who's
correct.
working on these systems, how are they background checked, how are you managing accounts to make sure that people don't have more access than they need to, or they don't have access to 2 sides of a system that would mean that they could edit financial information and edit code, right? So do we have segregation of duties? But there's a whole HR and business process component of the SOC report that isn't about the systems themselves.
Right. The last slide is vendor management and why ask. And I think we've kind of alluded to this. They are important. They're not a silver bullet to everything, but you're going to want to ask if you're doing certain business with people that have their your data, you want to know that your data is protected. And this is one thing. And that vendor that you're dealing with, as I mentioned, could have a subservice organization that they deal with. So you might get a couple different SOC reports, and you want to be asking for these on an annual basis too. And as Meredith alluded to earlier as well, if they have a gap, that they have that bridge letter, that they may have been doing some upgrades or changes. I just had a call with someone earlier today that was moving from a type 1 to a type 2, and we asked if there was anything that had changed major over the time frame, and they said just one slight one, and they documented everything, and now you're good to go. So when we come in and we start asking for all those artifacts, and you don't know what we're going to ask for, so that's how we kind of throw curveballs into it. But we have to show the operating effectiveness of all the different controls in place before we can sign off on a report. And we have a very lengthy process even on our internal side of how we review things before we sign off.
And that evidence could be anything from, Doug, you had alluded to, show me the background checks that you did on your new hires. It could be, give me the minutes of your management meetings, related to risk. So really, it is a broad spectrum of evidence that could be requested against any one of those controls.
And this is a time when you also want to make sure, as with what's happening right now with our current pandemic, with a business continuity management or plan, that you have it in place. And these are documents that are constantly updated and reviewed, that they're not just sitting somewhere idle and collecting dust, that they're actually being adhered to. You don't want to have us with having any weaknesses identified, listing those, or you don't have the proper management response. So there's all these different steps that kind of have to happen. And when you do this, you're kind of showing that you're doing your due diligence as well.
And the SOC audit, it makes your business better, right? It makes your business much stronger. And it also can be a great competitive advantage depending on the industry you're in. So if you can show that you have a SOC audit as your feather in your cap, it's a good thing for your business as well.
You're exactly right, Meredith. And as I spoke about before, once you get through this and you can prove it, that you've done it, you can apply for this AICPA SOC emblem that you can put on your website, and it does have an effect, because it does show that you're going above and beyond probably a lot of your competition.
Absolutely. Do we want to talk about any questions that might have come up?
Sure.
Actually, we don't have any in the chat now, but if folks have a question, please pop it in the chat.
Meredith, I don't know if you want to tell folks who Jana is, but she's kind of the glue that holds Vertical 6 together over there. So
I've never quite heard her described that way. Yeah, if you have any additional questions, Jana is our point of contact at Vertical 6, so her email address and her phone are up on the slide. And we really appreciate everybody coming today to learn more about SOC. So there's a question from Monica. Is there a certain size organization that should have a SOC evaluation?
As I said before, there's no real size. It really depends on what your product is. Again, we just finished someone that was a 6-person company that we did their readiness. They have a little bit of work to do, but I can tell you last quarter of 2019, with their client contracts with vendor, they're doing their vendor management process. Just the last quarter, they had 14 or 15 questionnaires come over asking them for SOC reports. So they figured that it was time, and that's what kind of forced this small startup company into the SOC. We've also done global companies that have over 100,000 employees, multiple SOC reports, depending on which platform it is. So there's really no designation of size. It doesn't matter anymore.
Great question, Monica. Thank you. From Dan, could you suggest an amount to budget for a small 1 to 50 staff medium, over 100 folks, or large 1,000 plus person staff. So I think the question is, what would a SOC audit cost for an organization?
Yeah, it's sadly it's kind of it doesn't scale by size of employees because it's still that people process and all that procedures going through it. From a budget standpoint, the first year I always tell people that it's probably going to be about between 40 and 50. And then the second year, it's probably going to be about 40. There's a little bit more heavy lifting on the front side, doing that SOC readiness, doing things. And I also have to give kind of a caution, because there are a lot of firms out there that will, and Wolf by no means is the highest priced out there. We should be in the middle of the road. But there are some companies that are very low price options. And I always tell people that buyer beware, because you know what my mom used to tell me, you get what you pay for. So you make sure that you do your due diligence on and do the proper checks on who you're using, not just their references, but if you have, you know, feel around to some of the other people that you know, always ask for multiple options. Last year, I lost 2 to low price options, and one within 2 months was back to us, and one within 6 months was back to us, just because they had such a bad taste in their mouth for the vendor that they selected to do the first steps. And both of those were for SOC 2 Type 1. Actually, one was a SOC 1 Type 1, and one was a SOC 2 Type 1. So it was, there's a spectrum out there, but I would say that that's a good ballpark for budgeting.
I'd also add into that, you know, there's the cost of the outside services to perform the SOC assessment, but also think about the amount of time it's going to take for your internal resources to pull together the materials for the audit. So that's a pretty important factor to also consider.
Right. There's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of things that are going to arise, especially if you ranked yourself at a 2 or a 3. You're going to have a lot of work. You're going to have a lot of policy. You're going to have a lot of templates coming over your desk to customize to what you're doing.
Thanks for that question, Dan. Any other questions? And I don't see anything else popping up. So if folks do have questions, you can certainly send those over to Jonna. So her email address again is jonna@vertical6.com, and her phone number is there as well.
Okay, and one other thing I want to mention too is that if you want a recording of this, it should probably be available on our website probably by next week under events.
And thank you everybody for attending, and thanks for the opportunity to share a little SOC 101 knowledge. When you start to get more into the weeds, it's like running down a rabbit hole, really. Meredith can attest to that.
There's a lot to it, yeah.
Yeah. This is at 15,000 feet.
Awesome. Thanks to the Tech Collective for the opportunity.
Thank you all. We so appreciate everything that you've given to us. And I just encourage folks to check our website at www.tech-collective.org. We have 2 great programs coming up: Cybersecurity Challenges on May 5th and The Road to Recovery on May 6th, kind of looking, what does it look like for us to be going back to work? So please check in with us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.